Okay, everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to the candidate forum for the Hopkins LAC. We appreciate you joining us. Um, I am going to run through some housekeeping and then I will give um, each of you the opportunity to give a 2-minute welcome. Um, I just want to thank you for joining us here in the midst of a busy campaign season. We have with us our candidates from District 46A, Larry Kraft and John Nagel. Thank you for being here. I appreciate you. Why don't we go ahead and each of you take your 2 minutes to introduce yourselves and your campaign, and then I'll run through our housekeeping. Larry, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thank you so much. So I'm Larry Kraft. I represent most of the community of St. Louis Park. I want to thank the Hopkins Legislative Action Coalition for hosting this forum. I'll start with some background on me. My wife, Lori, and I moved to St. Louis Park 21 years ago when I was recruited to run sales and marketing for a tech company. We have 2 kids who were born here. One is now in college and the other is a senior at St. Louis Park High School. Climate change and the impact it will have on our young people is why I'm involved in politics. 11 years ago, after 25 years in tech, I changed careers. I ran a national nonprofit that helped high school and middle school students take local action on climate change. And in the St. Louis Park and Hopkins school districts, students I mentored did a fantastic job. In St. Louis Park, they initiated our climate action plan, which passed in 2018 and is the most aggressive city plan in the state. Students in Hopkins High School actually started the process that took a bit longer, but eventually led to Minnetonka recently adopting its climate action plan. In 2019, I then ran for and won a seat on St. Louis Park City Council to implement the plan these students initiated. When this seat opened up a couple of years ago, I saw an opportunity to have a bigger impact on climate policy across Minnesota and represent our community's values in St. Paul. And I have loved the job. I love representing our community, and I love being able to affect issues that the community cares about. Minnesota is having quite a moment now. The work the legislature did in partnership with Governor Walz the past couple of years is being held up as an example for other states and for the federal government. Personally, over the last 2 years, I was lead author on a wide-ranging set of 27 bills that became law, including several climate bills that are nation-leading, and a bill on voter pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. Young people are why I got involved in politics, so although I'm not an education expert and don't serve on an education committee, how we educate our kids is super important to me, and I look forward to the discussion this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Larry. John?
Hello, how are you? Can you hear me? Hello? Hello?
Can you hear us, John Nagel?
I
There
I
you
I
are.
can hear you. Can you hear me? Hi.
I
Yes, we
can.
can,
And now I
John.
can see you and hear you.
Oh, that's even better, isn't it? Hi, how are you? It's a beautiful Saturday in Minnesota. So I'm a Minnesota kid, born and raised here. Went to the University of St. Thomas. Grew up in St. Louis Park, and other than a couple of years here and there, I ended up coming back to St. Louis Park, and I purchased the house that I was raised in, and I raised my 2 kids here. My daughter actually went to Hopkins many years ago. She's now in her 30s, graduated, has her own home, very successful. So I'm familiar with the Minnesota school system and St. Louis Park and Hopkins. Um, I'm a retired state trooper. I've come out of retirement during the last 13 years. I was a criminal justice chair for a college, and I taught college classes. And I've taught for the Minnesota Safety Council. And then I was also an instructor for the State Patrol for many years. Part of what I did with the State Patrol, I was actually a consultant for the federal government when it came to bike and pedestrian safety issues. So anyway, I've done a lot of stuff over the last 40 years. People say you should only have like a 2-page resume or a 1-page resume. It's really hard to fit 40 years onto that. The reason I'm running is Minnesota has a lot of problems. Now, I agree with Larry. Minnesota is a beautiful place. I have been backpacking and canoeing, and I love Minnesota, and I want to keep it as beautiful as it is. But we have some really big, huge issues, and those issues are with our kids. 50% aren't at math and reading standards, and that troubles me. The money's not getting to the really good teachers. I mean, we have some absolutely fantastic teachers in Minnesota, and they're becoming frustrated. So that's why I got back into it. I just think that, St. Louis Park needs a choice, and I would like to help every Minnesotan, every school child, every teacher, and I'd like to reduce taxes. And that's probably one of the biggest reasons I'm running.
Thank you so much, John. I appreciate that. I am going to walk through just a couple of housekeeping things for us. You can see this photo here that some of our student board reps have taken with our Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan. This is the high-level overview of what the Hopkins Public Schools Legislative Action Coalition does. We are a nonpartisan advocacy group comprised of school board members, parents, students, and community members. We advocate for education funding and policies at both the state and federal levels. We work closely with district leadership to identify pressing education issues each year and create a legislative platform approved by our school board to represent the district's priorities. We are recognized as a valuable resource for legislators, policymakers, and advocacy groups for research, community connections, and timely advocacy, and partner with the AMSD, MSBA, and neighboring school district advocacy groups to host community events on education, finance, special education, and school safety. We also organize an annual day of advocacy at the Capitol, including individual meetings with our 9 legislators. What you're seeing on the screen now is a map of Hopkins schools. You can see there's 7 cities within the Hopkins public school boundaries. And we have 4 state senators and 5 state representatives. This is a summary of today's schedule. We have already been through our 9, 10, and 11 a.m. Sessions. We're currently in our 1 o'clock, and we'll have 2 more this afternoon. So we appreciate everybody in the community joining us. And I'll go through our guidelines. The LAC does not support or oppose any political party or candidate. The views expressed in this forum are those of the candidates and not of the LAC or Hopkins Public Schools. The purpose of this forum is to offer an opportunity for voters to hear the candidates discuss important education issues that will affect students and families in our school district and across Minnesota. And Public Schools Legislative Action Coalition is a nonpartisan advocacy group. The guidelines for constituent questions are that the community had the opportunity to submit questions to this forum in advance by email or by scanning a QR code that we pushed out to the community. Questions that are unclear, hostile, or of a personal nature will not be used. Questions that are similar may be combined and summarized by the moderator. And questions may be submitted via chat during our Facebook Live or YouTube Live or on this Zoom recording, and the moderator will treat them as stated above, though only questions related to education will be entertained for the purposes of this forum. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to introduce themselves, which you have already done, and 1 minute for a concluding statement at the end. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to answer each question presented by the moderators. The timekeeper will present a running timer to keep track of the 2-minute countdown. The LAC would like to remind these candidates that this is not a debate, so please do not address one another. And the LAC reserves the right to utilize the mute feature if a candidate exceeds the time or does not abide by this format. We will get right into our questions. I believe that Steve Adams is going to kick us off here with question number 1.
Thanks, Jen. The first question is regarding vouchers, and both of you should have received this question in advance. But in recent years, numerous proposals have been made in the legislature to provide public funding for private and religious schools, either directly through vouchers or indirectly through tax credits, tax sheltered accounts, or by routing tuition through tax exempt organizations. So what is your reasoning on, what is your position on providing public funding for non-public schools? And please explain your reasoning. So, Mr. Nagel, you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Steve. I've looked at this, and it is public money, but it's also parents' money. And I think parents have the right to be able to use their tax dollars to send kids to schools that would most benefit what their children's needs are. There are all sorts of studies that show that vouchers actually help lower class income people, people of color. So again, I guess the question is that why haven't we already gone to vouchers in Minnesota? So if we truly are caring about families and children, we would allow that to happen.
Okay, Larry, your response?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. In general, I'm opposed to it. And the Minnesota Constitution seems pretty clear on it, especially relative to public money for religious schools. Article 13, Section 2 says, in no case shall any public money or property be appropriated or used for the support of schools wherein the distinctive doctrines, creeds, or tenets of any particular Christian or other religious sect are promulgated or taught. Also, the Constitution makes it clear that it's the legislator's responsibility to provide funding for a thorough and efficient system of public school throughout the state. So in general, I'm opposed to public funding for non-public schools, especially if it reduces the amount of funding provided for public schools. I think that's, per the Constitution, our responsibility and charter to do stuff. I could imagine what reasons why the state would want to provide funding for kids and students, regardless of whether they are in public or private schools, counseling, health services, transportation. There's some limited amount that we do already, but this funding shouldn't reduce funding for public education.
Okay, Jen, you want to assign the next question?
Yeah, I want to stop the timer that just suddenly started. Can you see the timer now?
Yeah.
Okay.
The big timer.
Thank you. Okay, if elected, your oath to uphold the Minnesota State Constitution includes the education clause, which reads in part, the legislature shall make such provisions by taxation or otherwise as will secure a thorough and efficient system of public schools throughout the state. As you are aware, increases in state funding in the state funding formula are not keeping up with inflation and expenses. Consumer price index increases over the last 2 years have ranged from 2.5 to 9.1%. The increase in the formula in 2023 still resulted in deficit spending in some districts, even with the reductions to curb expenses, due in part to many new mandates that came with the funding increase. Do you support an increase in the per pupil formula and removal of the current cap of the 3% on the inflation factor for the per pupil formula? And as a follow-up, do you have additional solutions to secure sound funding for Minnesota public schools? Larry, would you like to go first?
Sure. So I don't support raising the cap. I mean, we just put it in place in 2023. We certainly have had a abnormal inflationary environment over the past, post-COVID, but it's back down under 3%. So I don't support raising that at this time. I do think that while we've made a lot of progress on funding public education, you don't fix really 2 decades of disinvestment in a couple of years. And if really contextually, if you look at what per pupil funding would have been if it just kept pace with inflation over the past 20 years, it would have been about $1,300 more than what it was back in 2023. So we made a big step. My understanding is we closed about 1/3 of the gap, and I definitely think there's more work to do, but I wouldn't support on the inflation adjustment side. But some other things that we did in the cross subsidy and special ed, we filled about 50% of that. In EL, English language funding, we fund a little bit differently, but that cross subsidy is going away by 2027. So I think we've done a lot there. We do need more investment in support staff, more things to recruit and retain teachers, and some focus especially on equalization of school levies that helps property poor districts. And so I am for more investment in schools. I do want to make a comment. There was a question about a point in this about mandates, and a few points on that. One is, this is a huge portion of the state's budget goes to education. And so part of mandates is accountability. And some of those mandates, one of those that you're talking about was allowing tribal students to wear their regalia in graduation. So we have to get a little more specific on that.
Thank you. John?
Sure. When we look at that, if you actually look at what the law says, the legislature will otherwise secure a thorough and efficient system of public education. And I think it's pretty clear that that's not going on in Minnesota right now. Governor Walz touts of the $2.3 billion or the full funding of the school. Only $1.8 billion is actually making it to the schools. Larry brought up mandates. You have unfunded mandates given to the schools, and the folks that I've talked to, they're going with these mandates. We're now back to zero. So even though they fully funded us with the amount of mandates that the Democratic controlled legislature put on them, they're literally again back to zero. So I think that when we talk about funding, you really need to make sure that you're truly giving the money to the schools, to the teachers, and it's making itself into the school system. Those mandates cost about $1 billion, which are unfunded. So you take a look at the total amount of money that was spent, and then you put another $1 billion on that, forced on them by the legislature and the Department of Education. And what do schools do? Well, they're going to cut staff. And I don't know about you, but my daughter was not only was she in sports, but she was in music. And one of the first things schools do is they start cutting out arts and music and the fun things, the other things that the kids can do. And here's the other thing too. Unfortunately, we have huge mismanagement. Just look at Feeding the Future. Nobody's been held accountable for all of that money that has just been lost. I've not seen anyone in the legislature trying to find out what happened. No one's been held accountable. And then I go back to this. If we need all of these things in education, the legislature has been controlled by one party, and they have not done anything to fix these things. So I think when we look at that whole funding area, we need to take a look at how we're funding the schools and then what mandates we're putting on them. And I really truly think that it's time that we give this back to the parents and the schools and the principals and the teachers, because there's just simply too many areas where the money is going, and it's not always going to the schools.
Thank you. Okay, question number 3 is about MDE. How does your vision for public education in Minnesota align with the priorities of the Minnesota Department of Education? John, I'll have you go first.
Okay, well, obviously it doesn't go along with our Department of Education at all. The governor has hired some folks, and they're more concerned about social change than they are about math, reading, and English. And when you have an individual talks about overthrowing the government, and that's going to be part of our social studies, that gentleman's name is Brian Lozensky. You can look it up, and they're pushing an ethnic studies. And I think we all know that ethnic studies is not where we're talking about Native Americans or people in Norway. It's really pretty amazing to think that in Minnesota that we could have critical race theory and DEI coming into kindergarten and these lower grades. So I think parents need to realize exactly what's going on with the Department of Education. And right now, far too many activists are trying to determine what should be taught versus our teachers and our parents. So when you have someone who's an appointee by the governor that wants to overthrow the U.S. government, we have some really, really big concerns with that. They hired 170 DEI people in Minnesota. What are those 170 people going to do when 50% of our kids aren't reading or writing? So I think what we need to do is we need to eliminate all of the activists, and we need to get to our principals and our really great teachers and our parents so that we can actually take back Minnesota schools, which are being hijacked right now.
Thank you, Larry.
Yeah, I don't follow a lot of what my colleague there just said. I am aligned with much of what is in the MDE's plan. Here's the kind of things that it talks about. The Due North Education Plan is, sorry, I'm getting some feedback here.
Sorry, that was our timer that we're unfortunately, I think, testing on all of you. I've got your timer running on my clock, and I'll let you know if you're getting close.
Okay.
Larry, thank you. Sorry.
All right. So the education plan is centered on ensuring every child in Minnesota receives a high quality education, no matter their race or zip code, right? And that's really important because if you actually look at the demographics in Minnesota schools, almost 38% are students of color, which is up from 30% in 2016 and 19% in 2003. So, we can do fear mongering about ethnic studies, but what this is making sure that people that kids can relate to the stuff they're being taught and can see themselves in the teachers that are teaching them. So it's trying to be effective in our education. The other things that it does, it talks about expanding early learning opportunities. And I totally believe in that. Studies have shown that it's for every dollar invested in early learning, it's a 16-to-1 return over the course of the life of a student. And by the way, children who experience food insecurity early in life are twice as likely as their peers to be identified for special education services and to repeat a grade. Another great reason why things like feeding kids is such a great policy. And a third key point that I want to highlight from their plan is every student learns in a safe and nurturing environment with a focus on mental health supports. Very important, especially coming out of COVID. And Minnesota to date has a very low counselor to student ratio compared to other states. So this is an area that we need some focus on. Another point of the plan is caring and qualified teachers and expanding opportunities for students of color and Indigenous students. So as I said, I'm aligned in large parts with the direction that MDE is going.
Thank you. I would like to turn to our student board rep, Mia, for a couple of follow-up questions. Mia, will you just take a second to introduce yourself and ask a couple of the questions we've received from the community?
Yeah, of course. Hi, my name is Mia. I'm a senior at Hopkins High School. I really love political science, so I'm actually really happy to be offered this opportunity. For my first question from the community is, schools have changed how they deliver education, but not how they assess students. What are your thoughts on changing how to measure student success?
Larry, why don't you go first?
Okay. Yeah, great question. And I think this highlight, one point I would like to make is test scores are important, but they're absolutely not the only thing. Um, and things like attendance and the environment of the school are really important. Attendance, graduation rates, things along those lines. So, recently there was some information that came out kind of post-COVID of what's going on statewide. And what we're seeing is the test scores haven't really recovered, but attendance rates are starting to go up. And that's really important because you can't educate unless the kids are at school. And the other thing I would say is those test scores don't yet reflect the significant investment we made in literacy with the READ Act. And so initial results that we're hearing from schools that have been out in front implement that have been fantastic. So I look forward to seeing that go up in the future. But I think things like graduation rates for students that decide to go into trades, like how they can are able to do that. I think there are other interesting ways to look at schools. And when a parent goes and looks at a school, it doesn't just look at test scores. It also looks at the environment of that school and the supportiveness of the teachers. So I think we need to be flexible in how we look at schools.
Thank you much, John.
Thank you. Okay, so the next community.
Wait, Mia. Wait.
Oh, sorry.
Let's let John respond. All good. John, you're muted.
How's that? We better now? Okay. Nia, hi. My daughter again went to Hopkins. And, when you walked into that school, you immediately did not feel like you were in a high school. What I want to make sure is that every single child, every student, people like Nia, I want them to walk into a school and go, wow, I can accomplish anything I want to today. I want them to feel safe. I want them to feel welcome. And unless we have an atmosphere where the kids can walk in and they're not bullied, and they have teachers that are engaged, and we have parents that are also engaged, that's where we need to be starting with this. I think Nia will tell you there are really great teachers, and there's some really teachers that probably shouldn't be teaching. Now, I have to disagree with grades, because I have a feeling that if Nia gets an A on a report or on a test, I'm guessing she's pretty happy with that. And I'm not sure, again, why the Department of Education and the legislature keeps wanting to eliminate grades, because that's the only measure we really have. With what's going on in the schools, we have national experts that have criticized these new social studies. So when you have 3 people criticizing what's going on in our schools, it's going to be hard for Nina to learn and our other kids to learn. And when the Department of Education hires 3 people to take a look at their new teaching modules, and 2 out of the 3 come out and say, good Lord, don't do this, it's terrible. And yet the Department of Education does it anywhere. So maybe we need to redo the Department of Education so folks like Nina and all of our kids have a better ability to go into a school, feel confident, be happy when they're doing well, have engaged teachers, have engaged parents, and I think they'll have a much, much better experience.
Okay, thank you. And I did not mean to cut you off earlier. You guys both gave amazing responses. For the second question, many Hopkins public schools are unsafe for children to walk or bike to. We know that walking to school has tremendous mental and physical health benefits for students. What will you do to expand the safe routes to schools available for students?
Can I take that one?
Yes, please, John, go ahead.
Okay, so when you're talking about walking to school safely, I mean, are we just talking about being on the bus or walking or biking? When I worked for the federal government, we actually published a bike pedestrian safety class. We taught that all over the nation, and we showed schools and police officers and folks how to make a bicycle-friendly, pedestrian-friendly environment. Now, on the bus, there are certain things that we can do on the bus, whether it's cameras or, bus patrol kids to try to help with that. a big thing, and this was really messed up. We lost our SROs for a while, school resource officers. And I think Nina will tell you, school resource officers can turn into great friends. And it's someone where if a kid's having problems at home, or they're coming from an abusive relationship, or something's bad's happening at school, they can go to those school resource officers and they can confide in them. And when those school resource officers aren't there, those kids lose a great friend and they lose someone who's going to be able to protect them. We have a problem with law enforcement, that we've decimated our law enforcement community. But, in those areas in the morning, if I were the chief, there would be a patrol car, right there near the school, making sure kids biking and walking were getting there, safely. There would be enforcement of traffic laws and pedestrian laws, making sure that everybody's looking out for our kids. I used to teach school bus and pedestrian safety and school patrol things. So there's actually a lot of things that we can do. And there again, feeding the future, that scandal of all that money not being there. We could put money into those kinds of resources to help our kids, because we all want our kids to be able to feel safe when they walk into that room. We should probably also talk about reinforcing the schools. The schools need to be better at keeping people from getting into the schools that shouldn't be there. And that's called hardening a school. And there are great ways of doing that.
Thank you, John. I love the Academy Award cutoff music. Larry.
Yeah, thanks. And thank you, Mia, for the question. Safe Routes to School is a great program. A good chunk of the money from that comes from federal sources. I think there may be some state matches, but it's the kind of thing that we should increase investment in. And beyond that, we need to make it easier for people and kids to get around without needing to use a car. And in St. Louis Park, what I championed while I was on city council, and I do now that I'm in the state legislature, is that really strong active transportation infrastructure, bike and pedestrian. And when you're talking bikes, what you really need is protected bike lanes, not just painted bike lanes. You need stuff where you can feel comfortable sending your 10, 12-year-old out on their bike, and they have a nice, easy path to get to school. So one of the things that we did do was we, through some work in a small amount of sales tax in the metro area, there's funds dedicated to active transportation now, so that hopefully that can help with things like safe routes to school. I do want to comment on safety in schools. I think that what we really need to focus on is not, yes, our schools absolutely need to be safe, but getting to a hardening of schools, making them feel like, why are we doing that, right? Because we have too many guns in society. So if you really want to make schools safer, we need to attack the issue of gun violence prevention.
Thank you so much. Mia, do you have one last question from our community that you'd like to ask?
Yes. Okay. For the last question, Minnesota is one of 8 states that provides free school meals for students. In all of these states, the program is more popular than expected and more families are participating. When we add inflationary costs for food and delivery, all 8 states are over budget. How can Minnesota increase and stabilize future funding to feed students?
I think this is
Larry,
mine
I'll have
first.
you
Is
go.
that right, Mia?
Yep, I'll have you go first. Thanks.
Yeah. So this is a great problem. This is a values point, right? Feeding kids is just so important, because hungry kids can't learn, and stigmatized kids, if they have a special ticket or things like that, can't learn. One of the other great reasons that this type of program is that very often what you would find in the previously is that a family may not have qualified for the free school meals program that existed, because they made this a little bit too much, and then they would hit some kind of emergency situation in their lives and lose some income, and then they would fall under that line, but they wouldn't be, there's so much else going on, they wouldn't be aware of it, and so their kids wouldn't have food, or it would really impact them even more. So making it sort of a baseline level, like, hey, we provide desks at school, we provide meals at school. It makes it administratively easier, and it's just a values thing that our kids are never going to be hungry. Now, so as a values thing, we did see that the program was more successful than forecast. That means that more kids are eating and more families are getting some money back in their pocketbooks because they're not having to pay for school lunches. I think that's a good thing, and I think it's that we need to fund that within our budget. And right now, as things are trending, it appears that a surplus is coming for next session. We'll see how it pans out, but I think this is one of those important things that when it comes to our kids and education that we need to do. I also want to comment about the Feeding Our Future stuff. It's horrible when someone defrauds the government. That should not happen. That program was put in place in a bipartisan fashion during a tough time of COVID by a Democratic House and a Republican Senate. And then we absolutely should hold people accountable to that.
Thank you, Larry. John?
Hi, Nina. I think feeding the kids is a fantastic idea. When my kids were going to school, every now and then, you could actually send money to the school saying, hey, just apply this to some kid that needs money, and that didn't seem to be a problem. If we just lowered our taxes so people had more money in their pocket, parents would be able to not have to make a choice between feeding their kids or paying the electric bill. And Minnesota's totally overtaxed. I'd take 160 DEI people that we just hired, and I would unhire them, and I would apply that money to feeding our kids. We have all sorts of areas where we could take money out. Now, the problem with feeding our kids is that it went to everybody. It didn't make any difference what your income was. So, someone with a very large income was saying, why am I getting these cards? They actually returned them. Now, if we would have not given that money to everybody, and if the legislature would have done their homework, and we would have actually targeted the kids that truly need it, which could have been done through the schools, we wouldn't have a problem. Now, that money, the way we're doing it right now, we're going to have to fix it because it's not sustainable. And as far as Larry talking about a surplus, the way they have spent money, going through the billions of dollars, we are going to have a shortfall in about 1.5 years, and Larry knows it. And when we have that shortfall, what are they going to start cutting? So my idea is that, yes, I want to feed every single little kid that comes to school hungry, but I also want to lower taxes, and I want to create jobs, and I want to make sure that parents have the pride and the ability to afford to send their kids to a public school and not be hungry. So a lot of the mess that we have is because nobody's doing anything about it. We can't continue to raise taxes. So yeah, do I want to feed every kid? I do, but I want to feed the kids that need it. I don't want money going to high income.
Thank you both. I am going to give each of you 1 minute to make some closing statements. And so, John, I will have you go first.
Sure. Larry brought up guns. Just recently, there was a 10-year-old that got into a car and was driving it through a playground. Now, we can blame guns all the time. When I talk about hardening a school, I'm talking about egress and entrances and making sure that when the kids come in, no one is able to get into that school that doesn't belong to it. We're not talking about turning them into a castle. We're talking about, again, a safe environment. And I think if we told Nina that she could go to school and not worry about any kind of a mass incident, I think she'd be really happy. Now, you can take a car and you can run it through a playground. We just saw that. Fortunately, none of the kids were hurt. So I want to make the schools safe, and you're going to make the schools safe by putting money into the schools. And again, how can you give the schools that much money and then give them all of these mandates and have that much money? And I want to go back to this too, and I think people need to understand this. This is from an article, and I'm going to be very brief. Walsh's agency, well, I got just cut off. So we just want to make things better.
Thank you, John. Larry?
That's right.
Thank you so much to the Hopkins Legislative Action Coalition. There is little that is more important than how we educate our kids. I think you heard two very different visions here of what we think that should look like. What I'm talking about is addressing a 2-decade disinvestment in public education. We made some great progress in these past 2 years, but there's more to do. And we must also invest in early childhood education. There's a 16-to-1 return for every dollar invested. Strong public schools are the bedrock of our community and economy, and every single Minnesota child, regardless of where they live or the color of their skin, deserves a high quality public education. I am proud of the work we did these past 2 years of investing in schools, putting accountability measures in place, and I'm excited to do more, and I ask for your vote.
Thank you. The music. Okay, the Hopkins LAC would like to thank you both for your time today and for your interest in education issues. The LAC members, along with your constituents, enjoy learning more about your priorities for education funding and policies that will affect the future of Minnesota students. We appreciate your candidacy and wish you the best of luck in the November 5th elections.